Welcome to the CEFI Summit Europe, the only summit bridging the gaps between limited partners, private equity funds, corporate executives, and entrepreneurs. With over 1,000 delegates, the CEFI Summit Europe is the only venue where LPs, private equity firms, corporate executives, and entrepreneurs meet, enabling them to move quickly from ideas to deal crafting. Gather great market insight with over 120 speakers and 6 tracks to choose from. You are looking at LBO World Revolution, Advanced Leverage Finance Part 2, Recaps, Second Lien, Mezzanines, and Yield Bonds. Introducing
Marc Favero. I work in Brinks France. In fact, I'm a founder and member of the Comité de droit financier de Paris Europlace, and we create the Cercle Gödel, and president of the Cercle Gödel, which is an association of inside counsel and corporate counsel in legal financial law, and we work in order to and I will explain what we will do in these 2 areas, and mainly in the Paris Europlace forum, in order to increase the level and to have a very well adapted tool with the French law.
Jonathan Navarro. I'm a partner at Allen Overy in Paris here. You may have guessed from the title of some of the speeches, I am specialized in leverage finance. In fact, that's almost all I do. Occasionally I do some debt restructuring. That's a sort of side effect that some of us have had to deal with together before. I will talk to you about leverage recaps and about some of the more interesting subordinated financings that you find in deals nowadays. And I hope that you will join in and have a bit of a discussion with me on those topics when we get there.
Paris Europlace, to be short, is the lobbying side of the Paris Euronext. I think it's clear like that. It's created in 1993, and it's tried to make the promotion of the Paris marketplace. What is very interesting for Europlace and why we try on legal side to be in is that Paris Europlace include everybody acting in the marketplace. We have some investors, we have some bankers, a lot of bankers, of course, brokerage firms, market authorities, which is very interesting, member of the government, member of law firm, of course, with Allen Overy notably, accounting and consulting thing, and so on. Paris Europlace, I will be short on the fact it gained recognition internationally and so on, is actually governed by a board chaired by Gérard Mestrallet. I think you know Gérard Mestrallet, CEO of Suez. And the interest of Europlace is to have study groups. In fact, it's a think tank. And in this think tank, the beginning, they think about financial things, how to promote the financial Paris place, how to be the best place and the first place in the world. He's acting in Europe area, is partner for implementation of some directive and some element with the government, with the authority, and so on. I think Europlace, which is relatively young, is now well established in Paris place and have a good name. Why we create the Committee of Financial Law? First thing is when we try to discuss on legal side with the bankers, with the Association of Bankers Law, or with a law firm, it was difficult to create something together. In fact, when we discuss in the Cercle Gödel as corporate law firm, inside corporate lawyer, we tried to discuss with the lawyer in the bank. It was very difficult because this person thinks that they could discuss only as institution with institution. And if we discuss corporate with banker, we could discuss one against the other. The idea is to not to discuss one against the other, but to find some common element, common answer to some problem which is common, and we try to have the best solution without having fight or something like that. And Paris Europlace is the well place to do it. We convinced Paris Europlace to create this financial committee, and one element is in London market. We have the same financial law panel, which has the same role, and try to find some legal solution common to French, to law, and with banker and with corporate entities. Now we are 45 members, contributors. We have some representative of legal department of bank and financial institution, industry representative and mainly legal department of this industry representative. We have regulator, Autorité des marchés financiers, Treasury, Ministry of Finance, Banque de France, representative of law firm, and some academics. In fact, we have the two authors we had published book in financial area. We have the authors in, and we could work together, or we had sometimes some professor and university professor in order to increase the level of the discussion and to have a deep analysis of the problem. The committee is chaired since its creation by Pierre Bézard, the former president judge of the commercial chamber of the Cour de Cassation. And our purpose is to update legal community and regulatory authorities in respect of financial and economic issues. And what is interesting for you is, in fact, to propose areas of reform and to act as a bridge to the judiciary. In fact, we have some judge within the group, and we could discuss with this judge to explain some position and to explain financial law, which is not very easy to understand for a basic judge. What was our work program? In fact, the first thing is we had, when we have the first meeting, we discuss about the position of the French law. And we discover that, in fact, we know everybody that the French law is not well recognized as a good tool for financial operation. And in fact, one element, the main law firm in Paris are not the French firm. It's Allen & Overy, Clifford Chance, and others, because they act under English or US law. The first reaction is perhaps English law is better for financial areas than French law. Very simple. In that case, we have to use English law, and that's all. But with discussion with the banker, we agree that French law sometimes are really superior than English law or American law. First of all, because French law is a writing law, or we could say continental law. French law is a writing law. And in financial areas, the main thing is to have the certainty of the solution. When we speak about netting, for example, netting is clear now under French law because we have a specific text. We describe when and how we could act for the netting. For English law, it's more complex because you have some precedent, you have not a text, you have to discuss with. And in fact, the main point is that the French law gives some certainty, and sometimes the certainty of the solution is more important than everything. In that case, French law is superior than English law. we think in that case we have to promote and to make some marketing about French law. First step. Second step is to analyze where the French law is not at the level we need or is not the pertinent instrument. For example, and for guarantee, it's clear that English law gives a lot of flexibility, gives some is well adapted for everything we could manage. French law is very rigid in that case, and we have some problem to use it. Consequently, we say, okay, we have to modify the French law where it is necessary and to promote French law where it is strong. We try to modify the law and we obtain some success. For example, it's very technical, but we obtain the modification of the Code monétaire et financier regarding the definition of the financial contract in order to make a difference between term contract with transfer of merchandise. And we obtained some modification, and this year we work on something which is interesting for you. It's a modification of law regarding guarantee. We have it here. The first, one thing very important, we try to work together with the banker in order to define what is a banking secret, for example. One thing is important is the refinancing of some operation. The financing is one thing, the refinancing is another thing. And the problem for the refinancing is main part of the scheme are built with CDO or other instrument like it. In that case, when we want to transfer CDO, we have some problem of definition of what is the what is the definition of the banking secret. And in fact, we are in a period where the banking secret is not well defined elsewhere. We propose some modification, and we have a common position with the Fédération des Banques Françaises. The other element, we had a very deep analysis of the situation of the guarantees, and for example, for the pledge. The pledge, in fact, in France, is not very easy, and it's not very easy to how do you say in English, gage sans dépossession, pledge without deposition.
Without disposition.
Without disposition. We suggest a big transformation of all the regulation of the pledge without disposition, and we try to organize a central register of all the pledge in order to have flexibility for the transfer, for the mobilization and the refinancing. The other one is for the FCC, which is a tool that I think is very common in LBO. For the FCC, we try to extend the capacity of FCC to issue some equity swap or to use insurance product. You know that FCC could use swap, but not equity swap. We try and we propose some reform, and we are now in discussion with the government in order to modify and to have some modification of the law. It's not done, but we try very strongly. As I said just previously, you have the new guarantee under French law, creation new form of pledge, and creation of the central register of pledge. And we have a strong and deep analysis of what is the dematerialization and the consequence of the dematerialization under French law. As you know, the French law was the first who organized the dematerialization of the share, which is not the case in Germany or in Spain. But we are not taking all advantage of the dematerialization, because all the legal consequences of the dematerialization are not already identified, clarified, and harmonized. And we propose a global reform of the dematerialization securities, which imply harmonization of various rules and transfer of properties. We give you the name of the... I just let you the name of the rapporteurs, different person we could contact, because our idea is now, and the main purpose, in fact, for me to be here, is not to give you some knowledge of something new, but is just to let you know that we have an organism in Paris Place. We could try to modify the law. We try to adapt the French law at the need of the market, and especially for your concern, for all the need that you could have in LBO operation. And you could contact all of us in order to start a discussion, for us to have a common position on, with the banker, with the government, and so on, and to change the things.
Thank you, Mark. The kind of things I deal in are the reason why Mark and his committee exist, because we keep doing things that are right at the very edge of what is feasible under the current legal system, because we are perpetually trying to track what happens in the US markets, in the UK market, and try and use those products in France. I'm South African originally, but I'm actually a French lawyer, so like Mark, I try and promote French law as much as I can. I've only ever practiced law in France, so don't worry. I just operate in a market where you have to be a little bit bilingual, where you have to be quite flexible. You may actually think that the subjects that I'm talking about are a little bit of a bric-a-brac, because they're quite different. The first topic that I'm going to talk to you about is leveraged recapitalization, which is something that we've seen a lot of over the last few years. And I will then talk to you about some of the subordinated debt instruments that are used in leveraged buyouts these days, and which have some sort of magic ring about them. They have very fancy names, but in fact, I will try and explain to you that while they are very useful instruments, they're actually not as complicated or as fancy as that. The first subject we're going to talk about is leveraged recapitalization. In the last 2 years or so, there have been a huge number of deals which have been recapitalized. I won't go through the list, I'm sure all of you can read. But you'll see that some of the really big leverage buyouts that were done over the last few years have been recapitalized. Some of them have been recapitalized, resold, sometimes recapitalized, resold, recapitalized, resold again. It's a very strange market from that point of view, the Paris market, because the stock market isn't as liquid as some, so a lot of the exits are actually done by means other than the normal either trade sale or a listing on the stock market. You will also see from that list that leveraged recaps, sorry, I'm going to abbreviate, it sounds like jargon, but it's easier to say than recapitalization. Leveraged recaps are usually generally used for tried and tested credits. You won't find many recaps on the sort of smaller end of the LBO market or the smaller mid caps. You always find that it's a credit that has performed well, that has usually repaid a chunk of its debt through the normal cash sweep provisions that you have in the loan documentation, so that you know that this is a good performer. In fact, it's almost become a traditional way of structuring a deal. You go in, you buy the business, a couple of years later you do a leverage recap, and a year or two after that you sell off the asset, preferably to one of your mates who will start all over again. I'm just joking, but there are actually a lot of secondary and tertiary and more buyouts in the Paris market. Some of those deals referred to have been the subject of more than one LBO. What is the purpose of a leverage recap? In fact, there are two different purposes, and they sometimes actually pull in different ways when you get into the nitty-gritty of negotiation. The first purpose is to accelerate the return on investment for the sponsors. If you get your money out faster, that's going to improve your rate of return on your investment. Instead of waiting for 4 or 5 years, you're going to get at least some of your money out after 2 or 3 years. That's usually quite good for your return on investment. Your investor's going to be happy, and you can start the cycle all over again, because you can go out and raise a new fund and start doing more LBO deals. And as you all know, there's quite a lot of liquidity in the market at the moment, so there's a lot of money washing around. This probably helps with that. The other, and this is much better for the business, it's of less importance to the shareholder, but it has some importance nevertheless, is to reduce the overall cost of the financing of the deal by paying out the expensive subordinated debt tranches that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, because they're wonderful, they're very useful when you're going into a deal, and there's a lot of risk flying around. But when you have discovered that you have a tried and tested credit and that everything is going fine, mezzanine, mezzanine high yield bonds, whatever else you can think of, all the subordinated tranches of debt are very expensive. They tend to have interest rates of anything up to 15 percentage points over the base, the Euribor, whatever your base rate is. That's a lot of money. If you can recap your deal at 1.5% or 2% over Euribor, you can see immediately that that's going to put a lot less strain on the cash flow. Although, of course, and we'll talk about that again later, a lot of the subordinated instruments actually have a payment in kind feature. So where you roll up the interest, you don't actually pay cash interest. So it's just sitting there like a time bomb in the background. I have a question for you. I don't actually know the answer to this. Is the fashion for leverage recaps just driven by today's high liquidity in the bank market? There's a lot of money washing around. Banks are competing very aggressively to get mandates, and they have a lot of money that they need to utilize and earn a return on. Or is it actually a phenomenon that's here to stay? And that's where I said that the two purposes actually drive against each other. The accelerating return on the investment for the sponsors, that's going to mean that this is going to be a long-term tendency and that people are going to continue to do leverage recaps even when there isn't so much money around, and even when the interest rates have gone up a little bit, even quite a lot in fact, because the accelerated return on investment makes up for the added cost in the business. Obviously, you have trade-offs. I'm not a financier, but you can see when you put this all into your financial model, there comes a time when you do your calculations, it makes sense to recap even if the interest rate is relatively high. On the other hand, of course, the other reason, which is to reduce the cost for the business so as to put less tension on your cash flow, that's going to drive it the other way. So as soon as the money starts getting expensive, let's say a few deals crater, oh dear, I hope that doesn't happen. Let's say a few deals crater, that might actually put at least a brake on the levels of debt that are being lent. I don't think it'll go away, or at least I hope so, or I'll be out of a job. What is a leverage recap? Well, unfortunately, or fortunately for me, there is no such thing as a standard leverage recapitalization. It really depends on every deal and on every business. I mean, that is one of the fun things about leverage buyouts, is you never get bored because every deal is different, every business is different, you always learn something new. So you keep yourself busy, occupied, and you learn about new industries and new techniques. The structure of a leverage recap will be driven by the level of return that is required by the sponsors. In some instances, if you look at that list I have you in Le Grand, that wasn't the idea at all. There was no return to the investors. We were just taking out a lot of expensive debt and putting some pretty cheap debt in instead. Pretty cheap. It's relatively expensive for corporate debt, but it's become basically investment grade or quasi-investment grade debt, as opposed to 2% or 2.5% or 3.5% over your Euribor. You're down to much more reasonable levels. So that's not necessarily the driver there, but there are a lot of deals. Take Vivarte, which is another recent one. I think PAI was quite pleased to take out a big chunk of the money. That's going to put different drivers on the way you structure the deal and what it is you're trying to do. There are a lot of tax structuring constraints in these deals. I won't go into too much detail because I'm not a tax lawyer. I have a bit of an understanding of what it's all about. But for instance, in France, you can't do a recap in what is quite an obvious way, which is create a new holding company, buy the existing holding company, and merge the two of them. You will have committed at least 2 crimes by doing that. Literally crimes, by the way. You will have, one of the things you will have done is to breach what is called the amendement Charras, which is not a good idea. And you will also have done a quick merger, which the tax authorities don't like either. So You can't structure a deal like that in France. You have to do it other ways, which means you have to look very carefully at the availability of distributable reserves that you've got in the company, because somehow you're going to have to strip the money out of the company, because that's where the money is sitting. You can refinance the debt. That's one way of doing it. But if you want to get money out for the equity, that's why I say the structure can be driven in very different directions. If you're just refinancing debt, that's not a problem. If you're trying to get money out for the sponsors, you will have to make sure that there are available distributable reserves, or in fact, you will have to try and generate distributable reserves by externalizing latent capital gains that are in the group. They're quite often latent capital gains, so you're going to externalize those latent capital gains and distribute them up so that you can put the money in down at the operating company level. There's a few bankers in the room that I know, they'll tell you having the money in at the operating company level, that's top. It's right there where the cash flows are, it's right there where the assets are. And as a banker, you're much happier with that than sitting on a holding company with your debt up at the top, which in effect is structurally subordinated to all the ordinary creditors of the company. You don't necessarily like that. So what you will see most frequently in this is a new loan of some sort, which will refinance the existing indebtedness of the company, and you will most often find that loan will refinance the mezzanine indebtedness and the shareholders' loans that have been put in, either because they are expensive tranches of money, that's the case for the mezzanine, or because the shareholder loans were put there in the first place so that you can refinance them afterwards, although they tend to be the most subordinated piece of the capital structure of a deal. And you will find actually that you will have a constraint on your structuring, which is the existing financing documentation, because in the existing normal financing documentation will have the classic waterfall where you'll have senior debt. You may sometimes have a second lien facility. We'll talk about that a little bit later. You may then have a tranche of mezzanine, then a tranche of PIK debt, a PIK note, and then under that the shareholder loans, and then the real equity. So you can do with a whole cascade of things. And what you're actually doing in a leverage recap is repaying that capital structure back to front. You probably won't take out the hard equity just because deals aren't structured that way, but you'll be taking out the quasi-equity that's been put in by shareholders, and you'll be taking out the expensive mezzanine or high yield or whatever else debt. High yield is very complicated just because it's a capital markets instrument, and you tend to have very long non-call protection clauses in them, which means it's an expensive exercise if you want to take them out. Unfortunately, all this sounds very good, but you'll discover very quickly that there are a whole lot of constraints when you're trying to do a deal like this. It's not as easy as it sounds. That's what I'm paid for. Some of the constraints are financial. That's not what I'm paid for. That's what bankers are paid for, and accountants. Obviously, you have to have cheaper debt available in the market, although I mean, that is relative. If the object is to get money out for the shareholders, there comes a time when there's a trade-off between how expensive the debt is and how much money the shareholder wants to take out. It's very important, as I already said, that you have distributable reserves, or that you are able to generate them by externalizing capital gains. I mean, the typical thing is you will have an intra-group restructuring where one group company will sell a subsidiary to another group company, and that will revalue it. Of course, with new accounting rules, it becomes more and more difficult, so you have accounting constraints on doing that. You'll also find that the financial ratios that you have in your loan documentation will put a constraint on this, because just to take an example, but that high yield bond which is sitting up there, it's going to have some financial ratios which are actually going to put a constraint on what it is you can do. So you can't necessarily do your leverage recap the way you like if you've got a high yield bond sitting in there. So you have to bear that in mind. We've already mentioned the amendement Charras, which is a constraint on how you can do this kind of deal. And you will also find, particularly in cross-border deals, but even now in France, and even more so starting from next year, that there are what we call thin capitalization rules, which will prevent you from putting in the level of debt you might want to. In France at the moment, this only operates where you're talking about shareholder debt, which is a good thing. The new rules will expand that to any debt from a related party. So that's already making the circle wider. But if you go to countries like Germany, the thin capitalization rules actually apply to the actual, or the UK for that matter. The rule will apply to the overall level of debt to shareholders' equity. So you have to bear that in mind when you're refinancing, because you're paying it out. Even if you can count some of the shareholder debt as equity or quasi-equity for tax purposes, that's dodgy. It depends on the country you're in. Once you've started taking that out, you're going to be playing with the debt-to-equity ratio. You'll suddenly find you've got very little equity and a lot of debt. Have to be careful. The law doesn't like leverage recaps, particularly in France. You'll find immediately that you have issues like financial assistance. There's a rule which says that you're not allowed to make loans or use the assets of a company for the purposes of acquiring its own shares. That rule will obviously prevent you from doing things like using the assets or making upstream loans from the company that you are trying to recapitalize to its shareholders. You'll suddenly find that you fall foul of this. I actually think that under French law that rule wasn't necessary, but it was introduced by European directive, because you have a very strong rule relating to corporate benefit in France. Corporate benefit is taken very seriously. People have been sent to jail for misusing corporate assets. So you have to be a bit careful about that. And anything where you're going to be using the assets of an operating company to pay down debt of its holding company, particularly where that holding company was a special purpose vehicle used for acquiring that subsidiary, you might fall foul of this rule. You also have rules which relate to what directors are and aren't allowed to do in a company, and you may find that they may be held liable for mismanagement of the company, or that they are acting in the interest of a majority shareholder to the detriment of a minority shareholder, and that can get them into trouble. So you have to be very careful about that when you're structuring. Misappropriation of corporate assets is actually just the sort of reverse of the corporate benefit concept. The directors of a company must always act in the interests of the company. If they don't, they can go to jail because they've misappropriated the corporate assets to their own use. You have to be a little bit careful of that. People don't like going to jail usually. And you will often find a whole lot of constraints in the existing finance documentation. Those constraints in the existing finance documentation, because this has become quite fashionable these days to do leverage recaps, is you find that we actually try. It's very difficult because it goes against the sort of conservative grain that people have in leverage finance deals, which is actually to structure the deal in such a way that it can be recapped afterwards. You'll find that in some of the more sophisticated deals, the quasi-equity portion of the equity will be structured in such a way that the tax constraints and the legal constraints to refinancing them won't be there, because that instrument has been structured so that it's an expensive instrument, it's callable at will, or as at will as the senior lenders will allow the shareholders to. It will have features that make it an unfriendly piece of debt, so it will be in the best interest of everybody to take out this nasty piece of debt with a nice piece of cheap bank debt, right? So we will have done our leverage recap. So you structure around these things now. What you have to do also in structuring, because you will often, when going into a deal, the vendor will try and strip out as much of the cash as he can before selling. You will actually find that it may be of interest to retain actually distributable reserves and to pay the vendor cash for the reserves that are in there and not strip out the money that way. It's something that you have to bear in mind if you're looking to do a recap later. Don't use up all the distributable reserves to pay out a massive dividend to the vendor just before he sells the company to you. You will have made a rod for your own back because you will have to generate new ones. It's quite hard work sometimes. What you will also try and do is realize any latent capital gains that are in there by intragroup restructuring, or you will try and push debt down from the holding company into the operating company, and then channel that money back up. And that's where you run into the problem. As soon as you want money to go up, making upstream loans doesn't go down very well from a legal perspective. So you have to make sure you've got distributable reserves. You keep going around in circles. So remember, it's quite important to have distributable reserves. I think that's about all I have to say about this particular thing. I mean, if you have any questions on this, or if you want to keep them for then, feel free to interrupt me, because I talk a lot. If you want to talk some, please let me know. I'll move on to the next, and if you want to ask questions at the end. I mentioned that in the capital structure of leveraged finance deals, you find a whole lot of subordinated instruments. In fact, if you don't mind, I will reverse these and talk about the second lien first. Because actually, among subordinated debt instruments, this is the least subordinated of them. It's something which is quite novel in the leveraged finance market. It's appeared over the last 2 years or so. There have been a few done in France, not very many. Wheelabrator is an example. There's a second lien piece in there. There are a couple of other deals which have it in them. The characteristics of this kind of piece of debt is that you have a longer maturity than the normal senior debt. The typical senior debt structure, you will have an amortizing piece, which is a 7-year piece, and a bullet piece, which is an 8-year piece, and another bullet piece, which is the tranche C, which is a 9-year piece. And then you will have the second lien, which is probably a 9.5-year piece, just before your 10-year mezzanine piece. So you can see it's a slightly longer maturity than the other pieces of debt. You will also see that this kind of debt is not going to be prepayable for so long as the other senior debt is outstanding. That makes sense. It is supposed to be a second lien tranche, so it's not, if you're prepaying that, you're defeating the object of the exercise, which is to have a slight cushion for the senior debt. And you will find also that where it is prepayable, it will have a prepayment premium or a prepayment penalty, call it as you wish, in the early years to dissuade you from prepaying it. It's a bit like a capital market instrument in that respect. People don't like it being taken out to start with, even if you've got rid of the subordination issue. So if you're trying to do a leverage recap, this is unfriendly because it'll have a prepayment premium. That means it's got a cost involved. So you must bear that in mind. If you're looking to do a recap, be careful of putting an instrument like this in there because it will have a prepayment premium in it. Second lien, and that's exactly what it means, will have a second ranking security interest. This is where it starts getting complicated because you start playing on words. It's not supposed to be subordinated, and the last thing you want to say to certain classes of investors is this is subordinated. It is senior debt that benefits from a second ranking security position. That's the typical US instrument. In Europe, that's not actually true, and they look much more like a form of senior mezzanine than anything else. You'll find that that security is actually what they call silent or quiet. Silent means they can't do anything with it. Quiet means they have very limited rights of enforcement until the senior lenders have enforced their security interest. So they have a secured position. They're better off than an unsecured creditor, but they are in a position which is less comfortable than the senior lenders because they basically don't have or have very limited enforcement rights.
Yes? Do you think that it could be structured as in the US? It means with a second round, not prepayable, but not subordinated, as in the US.
Well, it could be.
Because in France, we have always seen second round with subordination.
Yeah, that was the distinction that I was trying to draw, Godric, because in the US, that's exactly the instrument that they have. Here in France, I have not seen, and in fact in Europe, for that matter, in the UK, the second lien that you have in Europe is actually, to my mind, a class of senior mezzanine, because it is actually contractually and structurally subordinated. Structurally, no, but contractually subordinated, usually. They won't call it that, because you might frighten off some classes of investors, but you will find that if you look at the intercreditor agreement on deals that have been done in Europe and in France, that the rights actually of the tranche D or the second lien holders is very reduced. You could structure it like that, it's just not market practice. There's nothing to prevent you, nothing, if you like, legal preventing you from doing that. You can do it, it's just not done. It's not the way it's done in Europe. For once we do things differently from the States, let's keep it that way. Normally you will find in a second lien tranche that there are limits on the amount of senior debt or other second lien or subordinated debt that you can put in. It's like what you would have in a high yield bond type instrument. You will have an anti-layering provision. It won't actually call itself that, but that's what the jargon is. It just means that because of what where these people sit in the capital structure, they're going to be uncomfortable having more debt in front of them. That's why they don't want more senior debt. So you will have an interesting discussion. There's a sort of norm when you're talking about mezzanine that they will allow you to put in an extra 10% or so of additional senior debt, so that when you're doing a restructuring, you've got a workout situation, the senior lenders can bail the company out without having to go for mezzanine consent. You won't find that with the second lien. It will be one of the cases where you'll have to get consent from the second lien debt holders. You have two different types of second lien in Europe. The next few bullets actually describe these two different types. You'll find those that have what are called maintenance covenants, is the typical kind of covenant that you will have in a loan agreement. And there are those that have the incurrence type of covenants, which are what you would find in a capital market instrument, which is you can do what you like as long as you don't breach the following ratio. Whereas the maintenance type covenant says you must do this, you mustn't do that. So you can see immediately the difference between your senior loan agreement and the high yield bond type instrument. You find both of these. In France, I've only seen to date maintenance type covenants. As we were saying in the discussion with Godric a minute ago, in Europe you'll actually find that you have mezzanine style standstill and payment blockage mechanisms vis-a-vis the second lien, which is why, I'm not supposed to say this, but I do say it, it's a form of senior mezzanine rather than a true second lien as the US market knows it. You will also find, of course, as a consequence of that, that if the second lien holder receives a payment that it wasn't supposed to receive, it is going to be required to turn that payment over to the priority senior lenders. So there are a lot of aspects which make it look like mezzanine rather than the kind of instrument that Godric described, which is the US second lien. A US banker wouldn't recognize a European second lien. It's a different creature. This piece of debt is almost invariably used to finance the acquisition rather than refinance existing indebtedness or anything else. It's of the nature of a sort of long-term structural financing requirement, so that's what you would use it for. There are two ways of doing it. One is to have the second lien as a separate tranche in your senior loan agreement. Optically, that looks very good, of course, because it really makes it look like a piece of senior debt. But you'll find, in fact, that there will be those restrictions on acceleration and enforcement that we were talking about a few minutes ago. So, in fact, well, it's not really senior debt. The only ones that have been done in France, as far as I'm aware, have been done in this form. They've been an additional tranche in the senior credit agreement. Although in the UK there have been some that have been done, and in fact in Italy as well, there's a huge deal that was done recently, Pirelli. It's no longer called that. I've forgotten the name of the new name. They've been the Pirelli cables business, where you actually had a separate second lien document. It's actually just another loan agreement, which looks very similar to the first one. Sorry, and now I'm going to backtrack because I put my slides back to front. We were talking about the second lien facility up to now, and that is, I would say, the most senior piece of non-priority senior debt that you can get. Right at the other end of the spectrum, you will find a series of what are called PIK instruments. PIK, it just means pay in kind. In other words, you don't actually pay the interest. The interest is rolled up or is paid in the form of the issue of interest loan notes. So you don't actually have cash pay interest at all. So what will characterize an instrument like this, like the second lien, there is actually no sort of true PIK instrument. There are as many PIK instruments as you care to make because it's what you want it to do. But the characteristics are the interest will be non-cash pay. That's not actually strictly true. You will find in some of the really sophisticated instruments a thing which is called PIK interest. This is PIC, pay if you can, where you will, once you've reached a certain covenant level, the senior lenders will allow the payment of a certain amount, a certain proportion of that instrument. So that is a pay if you can, PIC, but PIC. The rates will obviously be very high, I mean, really very high. You're getting close to the kind of return you would get on equity, or almost. More expensive than mezzanine, cheaper than equity, but sort of sitting somewhere in between. And occasionally, you will find that these instruments benefit from equity warrants. Equity warrants have become very rare on true mezzanine. You will find equity warrants somewhat more frequently on these because they are generally deeply structurally and contractually subordinated. So you have a quasi-equity piece of debt. In fact, the other classes of lenders will view this instrument as equity, and when calculating the financial ratios that apply under the loan agreement, will treat it as equity because of the very deep subordination. You'll find that it sits 1 or 2 levels above the senior debt in the group structure. It's contractually subordinated out of existence. So, and it will have extremely limited rights vis-a-vis the other classes of lenders. And in fact, the only sting that this kind of instrument normally will have is, in some form or other, the right to deprive the equity sponsor of its value in the business, and that's about it. The normal way of doing that is it will have a third-ranking security interest, which means that when everybody else has been satisfied, it can take out the equity value in front of the equity sponsor, so that it has some leverage. But you will find that these poor guys, if you ever get into a workout situation, have very little leverage other than that. That is about all they've got. So you have to be very, very clever to get a good deal for a PIK note holder in a workout situation. They're the guys who are going to be in trouble first after the equity. The reason the sponsors like this particular piece of debt is actually it is debt. It's not equity, and also it is provided by the market. It's not actually provided by the sponsors. So they benefit from the leverage that you get out of this PIK instrument, and they benefit from the fact that the other categories of lenders are going to treat this as a form of equity or quasi-equity. So it's a very hybrid thing. The thing that might put some people off, some sponsors off, are the very high cost of this instrument, and the fact that because of the level of risk, quite often you will find that the arrangers of this kind of instrument are pushing for some kind of equity kicker in the form of warrants or otherwise. Just like second lien, these instruments are not very standardized, or at least not yet. It's nothing like as stable as you will find in mezzanine. If you're talking to people about mezzanine, people will give you, or be able to sort of off the top of their head, give you a general idea of how the subordination of mezzanine works, etc. That is not strictly true when you're talking about a PIK instrument. You'll find some of them that have high yields type incurrence covenants. You'll find that others of them are just like a piece of junior mezzanine. And in fact, they will look quite often very much like the mezzanine instrument you had, except that it is very, very deeply subordinated. So you will find 2 different types. There's no particular reason why you would use one or the other. It just depends what the parties want and what their commercial deal is. Generally, you will find in this type of instrument that there are no financial covenants. That removes one source of potential breach of covenant. Not a bad idea. You will find that some houses who like buying this kind of paper, like ICG, Intermediate Capital Group, will actually fight very hard to have at least some limited financial covenants, which of course will be set at a level which is a long way off even the mezzanine, just to give the other classes of lenders some comfort, but there will be some level of financial covenant. They might actually just set it at the level of the business plan, rather than giving you headroom. Quite often, these instruments won't benefit from security, although, as I said a couple of minutes ago, quite often they will have third-ranking security just so that they have a technical, legal means of depriving the equity of their value, because relying on contract is great. I mean, and in France, you say that a well-made contract has the force of law between the parties. Great. But it means you have to go to court and fight about it. If you've got security, you're in a much better bargaining position when you're fighting with the equity sponsor to get your value as a PIK note holder out of the deal. You will also find different kinds of call protection. I mentioned call protection a few minutes ago. In mezzanine, you'll typically have, I suppose, what you would call a 3-2-1 or a 2-1 prepayment premium, which is if you take out the nice risky piece of debt in the first 2 or 3 years, the people who have taken that risk with you are not going to be happy, so they're going to ask for a prepayment penalty. The old days structure was you had 3% prepayment penalty in the first year, 2 in the second, 1 in the third, and nothing after. It looks more like these days you have 2 in the first year, 1 in the second year, and then nothing. In some PIK instruments, on the other hand, you will actually find that you have capital markets style call protection. That's really nasty if you're thinking about doing a leverage recap, because what you'll actually find is that it will contain a clause which means that you actually have to pay to the investors in your PIK instrument a very large proportion of the return that they were expecting to receive on that instrument. Basically, it's a discounted inflow of interest for the next, usually 5 years. That's a lot of money. If you think the immediate payment of the discounted flow of interest for the next 5 years, it's a big chunk of money to give them protection. Well, thank you very much, and enjoy your tea break, right?